Captain Daniel Hayes had seen more than his fair share of dangerous missions. After years of combat and hardship, he thought he had earned his peace, but peace was a luxury he could not afford. Living on a quiet, remote human colony far from the bustling galactic capitals, Daniel had finally found a sense of normalcy. He worked as a farmer, living simply and quietly. The nightmares of his past, the battles, the bloodshed, they all felt far behind him, or so he thought. It was a peaceful morning when everything changed. Daniel had just finished his daily routine, a cup of coffee in hand, as he walked outside to check on his crops. The sky was clear, the air crisp. He thought nothing of it when a sleek metallic ship descended from the sky. At first, he thought it was a passing military vessel or a civilian ship from the nearby trade routes. But as the ship touched down with a quiet hum, he felt something more, a sense of unease creeping into his bones. The door of the ship slid open, and two figures emerged. Both were tall, with sleek, elegant features, alien, but not like any species Daniel had encountered before. Their skin shimmered in the sunlight, a pale hue with traces of glowing blue running through it. Their eyes were a bright, intense gold, unlike anything he had ever seen. He tensed. "Captain Daniel Hayes," the taller of the two asked, their voice smooth and calming, yet commanding. "Yes, that's me." "What is this about?" Daniel asked, his instincts kicking in. Was this a diplomatic mission? A military inspection? He hadn't been in contact with any off-world groups for years. The alien stepped forward, and with a swift movement, handed him a small, holographic device. "You've been selected for a special mission, one that could affect the fate of millions across the galaxy." Daniel frowned. "A mission? I'm no soldier anymore. Whatever it is, I'm not interested." He turned to walk away, the feeling of unease growing. But the alien quickly caught up with him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't understand. We need your help. The fate of an entire species depends on it." Daniel stopped and turned back slowly. "I don't get involved in intergalactic politics anymore. I've left all that behind." "I know," the alien said, their tone sympathetic. "But this is not just politics. It is about survival." The alien's words hung in the air for a moment, and Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Survival? Of whom?" The alien hesitated for a second, then spoke again, more softly this time. "Of an Empress, the Empress of the Zenari Empire. She is in grave danger, and only you can save her." Daniel's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the Zenari Empire. They were known across the galaxy for their power and influence. The Zenari people were not just technologically advanced, they were also feared by many. Their Empress, Cytrala, was a leader of unparalleled strength and intelligence. No one dared to cross her, so why would they need a human like him? "Why me?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter now. The alien paused for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "You are a rare genetic match. The Empress requires your assistance to survive a critical cycle in her life. Without it, she will perish, and with her, the entire Zenari Empire will collapse." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean, a rare genetic match? I'm just a farmer. What can I possibly offer her?" The alien's gaze softened, almost pitying. "You have something she needs, a certain genetic compatibility. Without it, she will die, and if she dies, chaos will spread across the galaxy." Daniel shook his head. This was too much. A rare genetic match. His peaceful life was suddenly interrupted by something far beyond his understanding. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized the weight of the situation. If the Zenari Empire collapsed, it could bring destruction to many other species as well, including humanity. The balance of power in the galaxy could be forever changed. "So, what happens if I help her?" Daniel asked, trying to wrap his head around the situation. The alien stepped back slightly, their expression growing more serious. "If you help her, you will ensure the survival of the Zenari Empire and many other species. You will be an ally of one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy. The Empress will owe you her life, and that is something the Zenari do not take lightly." Daniel was silent for a moment, his mind racing. He had no desire for fame or power. He had seen too much of that in his military days. But there was something about this mission that felt different. The fate of an entire empire, perhaps even the galaxy, rested on his shoulders. "What do you need from me?" Daniel asked, his voice steady. The alien gave him a small, encouraging smile. "Come with us. Time is running out." And just like that, Daniel Hayes found himself being pulled back into a world he thought he had left behind. A world of galactic power, danger, and a desperate mission to save an Empress. Daniel had never been one for grand speeches or promises. He was a simple man, a former soldier who had seen the harsh realities of the universe. But now he found himself aboard a sleek alien vessel, racing toward the heart of the Zenari Empire, all because of a promise he didn't fully understand. His fingers gripped the edge of the seat as the ship's engines hummed, the stars outside stretching into lines as they jumped through hyperspace. Despite the luxury and advanced technology around him, Daniel felt out of place. The ship was pristine, shining with an otherworldly glow. The air was thick with the scent of unfamiliar flowers, and soft music played in the background. Though it did little to soothe his nerves, his mind kept returning to the same question: why him? The Zenari were powerful, a force to be reckoned with in the galaxy. They had conquered worlds, made allies with other mighty species, and even controlled entire star systems. But they needed a human, a retired soldier, to save their Empress. It didn't make sense. He had no desire for power or glory. His days of fighting were over. He had given up that life after a particularly brutal war that left him scared, physically and mentally. But something in the alien's voice, an edge of desperation he couldn't ignore, had made him agree. The Zenari Empress, Cytrala, was in danger, and without his help, the entire empire would fall. Daniel closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It wasn't the life he had planned. But how could he turn away when so many lives were at stake? After what seemed like an eternity, the ship finally arrived at its destination, a breathtaking space station orbiting the homeworld of the Zenari. The structure was massive, built into a rotating ring that surrounded a lush green planet below. The station was a hub of activity, filled with ships of all kinds, from sleek diplomatic vessels to warships of the Zenari fleet. As he stepped off the transport, Daniel felt the weight of the situation settle over him. He was about to meet the Empress, the very heart of the Zenari Empire. Would she see him as an ally, or would he be nothing more than a tool to save her life? The alien who had brought him here, a tall figure named Tessa, led him down a long marble corridor toward the palace. The walls were adorned with beautiful tapestries depicting the history of the Zenari Empire. It was a rich culture, one that had thrived for thousands of years. "Don't worry," Tessa said, noticing the tension in Daniel's posture. "You're not alone in this. There are many who believe in the Empress and her vision for the future. They will support you." Daniel nodded, but it did little to ease his worries. He had no idea what to expect. As they entered the grand hall of the palace, Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The room was a sight to behold. Tall columns rose to the ceiling, which was made of a material that shimmered like the night sky. The Empress's throne was a magnificent structure of black crystal, glowing faintly with an ethereal light. And there, sitting at the center of the room, was Empress Cytrala. She was unlike anyone Daniel had ever seen. Her skin was a pale shade of violet, and her long hair flowed like liquid silver, cascading down her back. Her eyes were a deep, glowing blue, holding the weight of an entire empire. Her posture was regal, and her presence demanded respect. Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as he approached. There was something otherworldly about her, something that made him realize just how powerful she was. "Captain Daniel Hayes," Cytrala spoke, her voice melodic yet firm. "It is an honor to meet you." Her eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, Daniel felt as though she could see right through him. He bowed his head slightly in respect, but his thoughts were clouded with uncertainty. "Your Majesty, I don't know why I'm here. I'm just a soldier, a man who has seen too much of war. I don't understand what you need from me." Cytrala's gaze softened slightly, though the urgency in her voice remained. "You may be a soldier, but you are also human, a rare and unique species with qualities that none of my people possess. Your body, your essence, holds the key to my survival." Daniel took a step back, trying to process her words. "I don't understand. What do you mean by essence? How can I help you?" She explained the Zenari heat cycle, how every few centuries, their kind underwent a biological shift that required a specific genetic match to stabilize their physiology and prevent death. Without the essence of a compatible individual, she would not survive the cycle. "You are the last hope for my life, Captain," Cytrala said softly, though there was an undeniable strength in her words. "And I do not take this lightly. You may not want to be here, but I need you, and I ask that you help me for the sake of my people." Daniel stood in silence for a moment, the weight of her words pressing down on him. It was too much, but in the pit of his stomach, he felt a stirring, a sense of duty, something he hadn't felt in years. He met her gaze once more. "I'll help you," he said, though he wasn't sure what this would cost him. But one thing was clear: this was bigger than him. And so, the unlikely partnership between a retired human soldier and an alien empress began, with the fate of an entire empire hanging in the balance. The days that followed were filled with tension. Captain Daniel Hayes had agreed to help Empress Cytrala, but the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him. He had been trained for combat, for leadership, not for the complex dynamics of alien biology. He had no idea how he was supposed to assist in such an intimate and critical process. As the ship traveled deeper into the Zenari Empire, Daniel found himself spending more time with Tessa, the alien who had brought him here. She seemed to know everything about the Empress and the Zenari way of life, and she had become his guide through this strange and foreign world. "We'll be arriving at the royal palace soon," Tessa said one morning as they sat in the ship's observation lounge. "You must prepare yourself, Captain. The Empress's heat cycle is fast approaching, and we cannot afford any delays." Daniel looked out at the endless expanse of stars, his thoughts swirling. "I'm still not sure what I'm supposed to do. I mean, I've helped people before, rescued them, fought alongside them. But this feels different." Tessa gave him a sympathetic look. "I understand. It's not easy to comprehend at first, but the Empress's need is genuine. Without you, she may not survive. And if she doesn't," she trailed off, letting the unspoken consequences hang in the air. Daniel nodded, trying to push down the uncomfortable knot in his stomach. "I'll do what I can, but I still don't get why it has to be me. Why not another Zenari, or someone with more experience?" Tessa's gaze softened. "The Zenari are a proud species, but our biology is specific. The Empress's heat cycle requires a very rare genetic match. It's not something that can be replicated with technology or any other being. You're the only one who fits." That explanation did little to settle Daniel's nerves. He had been thrust into this situation without asking for it. He just wanted to go home, to return to the quiet life he had built for himself. Yet here he was, preparing to meet the Empress once more. When the ship finally touched down on the royal palace's landing pad, Daniel felt his heart race. The palace was even more magnificent up close. It was an imposing structure made of polished black stone that seemed to absorb the light, giving it an almost ominous presence. Guards lined the entrance, their armor shining like mirrors. Daniel was escorted through long, elegant hallways, where every surface gleamed with perfection. At last, they arrived at a large chamber, the air cool and filled with the fragrance of exotic flowers. The room was illuminated by soft, glowing lights that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Empress Tytrala sat on her throne, her posture regal and commanding. As soon as she saw Daniel enter, her intense blue eyes locked onto his. Her expression was calm, yet there was an unmistakable tension in her features. "Captain Hayes," she greeted him, her voice smooth but laced with urgency. "I trust you are ready for what lies ahead." Daniel hesitated for a moment, unsure how to respond. "I'm ready to help, but I still don't understand everything. Can you explain more about what's going to happen?" Cytrala's gaze softened, and she nodded. "Of course. My species, the Zenari, undergo a biological cycle that comes once every few centuries. During this time, our bodies change, becoming more fragile, and we require the essence of a compatible being to restore balance. Without this, we would die. My heat cycle is no different from that of many other species, but it is far more intense and critical. For us, this cycle is not just physical. It affects our mind and our ability to lead." She paused, her eyes searching his face for understanding. Daniel was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. He had never heard of anything like this before. It was unlike any medical issue he had ever encountered, but the desperation in her voice was unmistakable. "So, you need me to help stabilize your condition?" Daniel asked. Cytrala nodded. "Yes, your essence, your biology, will help restore me. And in doing so, you will help ensure the future of the Zenari Empire. My leadership depends on it." Daniel felt a pang of discomfort. He had agreed to help, but he had no idea what was going to happen next. Still, he couldn't back out now. Too much was at stake. Tessa, who had been standing quietly nearby, spoke up. "The process will begin soon. There is no time to waste. You must trust us, Captain. Everything will be explained in time, but for now, we need to move forward." Daniel nodded, though his mind was still reeling. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay ahead, but he had committed to this, for the Empress, for the Empire, and for the countless lives that hung in the balance. With a deep breath, he turned back to face Tytrala. "Let's begin." And so, with that simple decision, Daniel Hayes was thrust deeper into the Zenari's world, where the line between duty and personal sacrifice would soon blur in ways he could not yet understand. The atmosphere in the palace was heavy with anticipation. Daniel stood by, feeling the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on him. The Empress's heat cycle was no small matter, and though he didn't fully understand the intricacies of Zenari biology, one thing was clear: this was not going to be easy for anyone involved. Cytrala sat at the center of the chamber, her posture regal as always, but her eyes revealed a certain vulnerability that Daniel hadn't seen before. There was a quiet strength in her, but it was clear that the time had come for her to face this biological transformation, one that could make or break her future as the Empress of the Zenari Empire. Tessa, ever the calm presence, approached Daniel. "The process is about to begin, Captain. You must remain steady. The Empress will rely on you." Daniel nodded but couldn't help the nervous tension in his body. He was a soldier, used to the chaos of war and the adrenaline of battle. This was different. He wasn't sure how to prepare for something so strange and intimate, but he had made a promise. He couldn't back out now. Tessa led him closer to Cytrala, who now looked at him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Her eyes were glowing, the blue light brighter than before. She gave him a slight nod, a signal for him to approach. "Captain," Cytrala said, her voice steady yet filled with underlying need. "You are here to help me. I trust you will follow through. The Zenari Empire depends on it." Daniel could see the seriousness in her expression. This wasn't just about her survival. It was about the survival of an entire empire. The weight of her words settled heavily on his shoulders. "Don't worry," Tessa reassured him, noticing the tension in Daniel's posture. "You're not alone in this. There will be others to assist, but your role is vital." Daniel couldn't help but feel a little more reassured by Tessa's calm demeanor. Still, his mind raced with questions. How was he supposed to help her? What would this process involve? And more than anything, would he be able to do what was required of him? "Ready, Captain?" Tytrala asked, her voice softer now, but still firm. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I'm ready." Tytrala nodded, and at that moment, the air in the chamber seemed to change. It grew warmer, as if the very room itself was reacting to the Empress's body beginning its cycle. Her skin, which had been a soft shade of violet, now began to shimmer with an iridescent glow, as though her body was preparing for something greater. "Everything is beginning to align," Tessa explained. "Her body is reacting to the cycle. You must be present for it all." Daniel nodded, unsure what that meant but feeling the weight of the moment. He had to stay focused. Tytrala closed her eyes, her expression one of deep concentration. The chamber grew even warmer, and the air felt thick with an unfamiliar energy. Daniel watched as her breathing became deeper, slower, as if she were drawing in the very life force of the universe itself. Tessa stepped forward, positioning herself near the Empress, her voice soft and melodic. "The heat cycle is a delicate process, Captain. It requires balance. The Empress will need your essence to stabilize her body and mind. This must be done carefully, with precision." Daniel wasn't sure exactly what Tessa meant, but the air around him seemed to pulse with energy, and his instincts told him that everything was happening fast. Tytrala's eyes flickered open, and she looked at him again, her gaze a mix of strength and vulnerability. "Trust me," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "You are the key to my survival." Daniel's heart raced, but he didn't back away. He stepped forward, closer to Tytrala, his breath catching in his chest as he tried to prepare himself for whatever was to come next. The Empress's skin shimmered more intensely now, her whole body radiating an otherworldly glow. Her expression changed slightly, a look of concentration settling over her features as she continued to undergo the transformation. Tessa moved aside, leaving Daniel standing directly before Tytrala. There was a silent moment where time seemed to slow down. Daniel couldn't ignore the overwhelming responsibility now resting on his shoulders. He wasn't just here to help her survive. He was here to ensure the future of the entire Zaneri Empire. Tytrala extended a hand toward him, her fingers trembling slightly. "I need you now, Captain," she said softly, but there was an urgency in her voice that couldn't be ignored. Daniel took her hand, the cool touch of her skin contrasting with the warmth of the room. He felt a surge of energy between them, as if something deep within his very being was aligning with hers. It was like nothing he had ever experienced, nothing that could be explained by science or logic. And in that moment, Daniel understood. This was more than a duty. It was a bond, one that could change everything. For both of them. Tytrala's breathing quickened, and Daniel could see the strain on her face. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Do not falter." He nodded, squeezing her hand gently, and as the room seemed to pulse with energy, Daniel knew that he was no longer just a soldier. He was now a part of something much greater, a part of the survival of an entire species. The process had begun, and there was no turning back now. The chamber was silent except for the soft hum of the energy around them. Daniel stood close to Tytrala, still holding her hand, feeling the pulse of her energy like a quiet storm waiting to break. Her breathing had become heavier, more rhythmic, but there was a tension in the air, a sense that something was changing, something critical. Tytrala's eyes opened again, locking onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. He had never seen her so vulnerable, so human. She was the Empress, a figure of strength, power, and authority. But in this moment, she was simply a being in need, fighting a battle that wasn't of her making. "Captain," she whispered, her voice strained but steady, "I need you to remain calm. You mustn't falter now. My body, it is changing, and I need your strength to guide me through this." Daniel nodded, even though his heart was racing. He wasn't sure what to expect next, but he could feel the heat in the air, the pressure building around them. He had seen battlefields before, those moments when everything seemed to slow down as the stakes grew higher. But this was different. This was personal. The future of the Zenari Empire, of the people she led, rested in his hands. "You're doing well, Empress," Daniel said, trying to steady his own voice. "Just breathe. I'm here." Citralla's hand tightened around his, her fingers trembling. "It's not enough to simply breathe. I need your essence to stabilize me. My body is not built to endure this without the help it requires." Daniel felt the gravity of her words sink in deeper. This wasn't just a biological process. It was a battle, one that required every ounce of willpower and understanding from both of them. He wasn't sure how his essence, his human biology, would help, but he had no choice but to trust the Zenari's knowledge and wisdom. Tessa stood quietly at the side, watching closely. She had been with Citralla through countless cycles, and though she never showed it, Daniel could tell this was as difficult for her as it was for the Empress. The Zenari were a proud species, and it wasn't easy for them to ask for help, especially not from a human. "You must prepare, Captain," Tessa said softly. "Her body is ready for the next stage. The energy you're both sharing will intensify. Do not be afraid." Daniel took a deep breath and focused on Citralla. Her eyes were closed now, her face slightly flushed as if the heat of her transformation was becoming unbearable. Her regal posture had begun to falter, her shoulders drooping slightly under the strain. Despite the situation, she still carried herself with an undeniable dignity. "I'm with you," Daniel said quietly, though he could feel the discomfort in his own body starting to rise. Something was happening, a shift in the air around them. The temperature in the room seemed to rise with each passing moment, and the energy between them felt more alive, more intense. Citralla opened her eyes once more. Her gaze held a flicker of uncertainty, but also determination. "I must trust you, Captain," she said, her voice almost pleading now. "You are the only one who can help me." Daniel didn't know how he could help, but he could see the fear in her eyes. He wasn't sure what would happen if they failed. He wasn't sure what would happen if he couldn't do what was needed. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to leave her to face this alone. The silence between them stretched for a long moment, but it was broken when Citralla gasped suddenly, her body trembling. "It is too much," she whispered, her voice strained. "The cycle, the heat, it's overwhelming." Tessa quickly moved forward, her face serious. "Captain, now is the time. You must help her now or everything will be lost." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. There was no more time to think. He had to act. He placed both hands on Citralla's shoulders, steadying her as she leaned forward, her body shaking. He could feel the power surging between them, a strange connection that felt almost electric, like their very souls were entwining. "Empress," Daniel said softly, "I'm here. You're not alone." Citralla closed her eyes and nodded, and in that moment, Daniel realized the truth. This wasn't just about survival, it was about trust. Trust in each other, trust in the bond they were creating. He didn't fully understand the process, but he could feel that something deep inside of him was aligning with her, something that would help her through this. Her body shuddered again, and for a moment, Daniel thought she might collapse. But then, with a deep breath, she stood up straighter, her composure returning, if only slightly. The glow around her intensified, and the energy between them seemed to grow stronger. Tessa stepped back, her expression unreadable. She had seen this process many times, but even she knew that it was different with Daniel. The Empress's survival no longer seemed like a certainty. It was fragile, teetering on the edge of something greater than anyone had expected. "You are doing it, Captain," Tessa said softly. "Keep going. You are the key." Daniel nodded, determination setting in. He wasn't going to fail her now. He could see the Empress's pain, and he would do whatever it took to help her through it. The next steps of the cycle were dangerous, but Daniel would see this through to the end. The chamber was still. The only sound now was the rhythmic breathing of the Empress, and the steady pulse of energy flowing between them. There was no turning back now. The chamber was quiet now, save for the rhythmic hum of energy that filled the space around them. Cytrala's breathing had slowed, but there was still an underlying tension in the air. The glow around her flickered like a dying star, a sign that the heat cycle was reaching its peak. She had been through this process before, but never with a human, and never under such circumstances. Daniel stood by her side, his hand gently resting on her arm, offering the only support he could provide. It was strange, standing there as an equal to someone so powerful, yet so vulnerable. He knew his role now. He wasn't just a protector. He wasn't just here to help her survive. He was part of the solution, part of the bond that was keeping her grounded in this moment of chaos. Tessa stood in the corner, her eyes fixed on Cytrala, but her face was unreadable. It had been clear from the beginning that she held deep respect for the Empress. But Daniel had begun to wonder if there was something more to her silence. Maybe she was waiting for something, or maybe she was trying to understand how this was all unfolding. The tension in the room seemed to swell, and Cytrala's voice broke the stillness. "Captain," she whispered, her eyes opening just enough to meet his gaze. "I can feel the pressure building. It's too much. I don't know how much longer I can hold on." Daniel could see the strain on her face. She was fighting something beyond her control, something that was testing the limits of her strength, and yet she was still fighting. It reminded him of the way soldiers held their ground, even when it seemed impossible to win. "You've come this far, Empress," Daniel said softly, his voice steady. "You've fought through harder challenges. You can do this." Cytrala let out a weak sigh, her fingers trembling against his hand. She was still the Empress, still the ruler of an entire empire. But in this moment, she was simply a being in need of help. Daniel could feel her strength, but it was beginning to waver, like a rope fraying at its edges. The pressure in the room seemed to intensify with every passing second. Daniel could feel the pull of the energy that connected them, like an invisible thread that wound between their bodies. It was more than physical. It was something deeper, something intangible that he couldn't explain. But it was real, and it was guiding him through the chaos. "You are stronger than you realize," Daniel said, his words more for himself than for her. But as he spoke, he felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about helping Cytrala survive the heat cycle. This was about helping her find the strength she had buried deep within herself. It was about pushing through, even when everything seemed against you. Cytrala's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Daniel saw the flicker of something else in her eyes. Vulnerability, maybe even hope. "I've never had someone to help me like this before," she admitted quietly. "I've always been the one who leads, the one who commands. I've never needed anyone." Daniel nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had heard stories of leaders like her, powerful, unyielding, but always alone in their struggles. It was hard for someone like Cytrala to admit that she needed help, that she was dependent on someone else. But in this moment, Daniel was the one who could offer that help. He wasn't just her ally. He was the bridge between her strength and the fragile state she was in. Tessa finally spoke, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "The process is nearly complete, but there is one last test. You must hold on just a little longer, Empress. Do not let go now." Cytrala's head drooped slightly, exhaustion taking over, but her grip on Daniel's hand remained firm. "I will not give up," she whispered, though it was clear that the fight was taking everything from her. She had reached the limits of what her body could handle, and yet there was still a sense of determination in her voice. The room seemed to vibrate with energy, the air thick with anticipation. Daniel could feel the shift happening. Cytrala's body was beginning to glow brighter, her energy surging. He could see the faint outline of the cycle's final stage beginning to form around her, an aura of intense light and heat that surrounded her like a storm. It was a beautiful and terrifying sight, but Daniel knew that it was also the key to her survival. This final stage would either push her beyond her limits or restore her to full strength. There was no middle ground. Just a little longer, Empress, Daniel whispered. You're almost there. Her eyes met his again, this time filled with gratitude. Thank you, Captain. You have given me strength when I thought I had none left. The glow around her grew even brighter, a pulse of energy that radiated through the room. The air felt heavy, thick with the power of her transformation. Daniel couldn't help but marvel at the sight. This was no ordinary being standing before him. This was an empress, a ruler of an empire, battling the most primal force of nature in order to survive. Tessa stepped forward, her expression resolute. The heat cycle is almost complete. Stay with her, Captain. She needs you until the very end. Daniel nodded, not breaking his gaze from Cytrala. They were close now, closer than ever. The finish line was in sight, but they weren't there yet. There was one final step to take, and together they would cross it. The energy in the room had changed. The swirling light around Cytrala began to steady, and the air was no longer heavy with the overwhelming pressure. Slowly, the glow around her softened, shifting from bright intensity to a calming, gentle radiance. It was as if the storm that had raged within her was finally beginning to subside. Daniel remained at her side, his hand still firmly holding hers. He hadn't let go once since the process had begun. His muscles were sore, his eyes tired from the long hours, but the sight before him made it all worth it. Cytrala had made it through. She had reached the final stage of her heat cycle and come out stronger. The Empress's breathing was steady now, her chest rising and falling in calm, measured rhythms. There was a softness to her expression that hadn't been there before. Her regal demeanor, while still present, seemed to have melted away, leaving behind someone far more human. She looked at Daniel, her eyes full of gratitude, and for the first time, a genuine smile touched her lips. You did it, she whispered, her voice still hushed, but no longer filled with desperation. I couldn't have done it without you. Daniel's lips twitched into a small smile, though he was still in awe of what had just transpired. He wasn't sure if he truly understood the full extent of what had happened, but one thing was clear. Cytrala had been tested beyond what anyone could have imagined, and she had survived. It wasn't just me, Daniel said softly, glancing over at Tessa, who had been silently observing from the sidelines. We all helped. Tessa nodded, her face impassive, but there was a glint of respect in her eyes as she met Cytrala's gaze. You were the one who made it through. You fought, and you won. Cytrala nodded, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling as she let out a slow, contented sigh. The process had been grueling, a test of endurance and willpower that few could have survived. But somehow, she had done it. She had pushed past the limits of her body, found strength in the most unlikely places, and emerged victorious. I feel different, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Stronger, clearer, as though a weight has been lifted. Daniel could see it in her eyes, the clarity, the focus. She was no longer consumed by the cycle. She had conquered it. Her energy was no longer frantic, but rather controlled, measured. It was as though she had reclaimed her power, not just as the Empress, but as a person in her own right. Do you feel better? Daniel asked, his concern still evident in his tone. He couldn't help but wonder if there were lingering effects, if the process had left any permanent damage. Cytrala looked at him, and for a moment, her gaze softened even more. I feel whole again. I am at peace. It was a relief to hear her say that. The last few hours had been a whirlwind of tension, fear, and uncertainty. Daniel had seen her struggle, watched her fight to stay strong even when it seemed like she might break. And now, as she sat before him, a peaceful aura surrounding her, he realized just how far they had come. I'm glad, Daniel said, his voice genuine. I'm glad we could help. Cytrala gave a small nod, her eyes flickering toward the two humans who had stood by her side through it all. She had been the ruler of an empire, powerful and unyielding, but she had never known true vulnerability until this moment. She had never understood what it meant to rely on others until now. "I see now," Scifi said slowly. "That strength doesn't always mean standing alone. Sometimes true strength is found in the willingness to trust others, to lean on them when needed." Daniel's heart swelled at her words. He had never expected this kind of understanding to come from her, especially not after everything they had been through. But here they were, three individuals, once strangers, now bound by a shared experience, a bond forged through struggle and resilience. "We'll always be here for you," Tessa said, her tone resolute. "No matter what." The Empress's gaze flickered to Tessa, and for a brief moment, Daniel could see the flicker of a new kind of respect in her eyes. She wasn't just the leader of an empire anymore. She was a woman who had been tested, who had come through a trial and emerged with newfound strength. And it was clear now that her path moving forward would be shaped not by her titles, but by her willingness to embrace her humanity. "I owe you both much," Scifi said softly, her voice filled with a quiet, humbled sincerity. "I will not forget this." Daniel could see that, in this moment, something had changed. She wasn't just the Empress anymore. She was a person, with all the complexities and vulnerabilities that came with it. And together, they had helped her find her way back to herself. As the hours passed, and the energy in the room finally began to settle, the three of them sat together in comfortable silence. They had faced the unknown, had pushed through fear and uncertainty, and in the end, they had found something stronger than they ever expected. And as they looked toward the future, one thing was certain. They were no longer just individuals fighting for their own survival. They were allies, bound together by their shared strength, resilience, and the knowledge that, no matter what lay ahead, they could face it together.